Hello, welcome anybody who's watching this. This is going to be a podcast recording for the Dharma Gates podcast with Shugen Roshi here, and then myself. My name is Aaron, and I'm one of the founders and current ED of Dharma Gates. And just to share a couple words about what Dharma Gates is before we start talking. Dharma Gates is a 501c3 that works to help young people find their way to and connect to and experience the variety of practice traditions that focus on meditation in the Buddhist tradition. And we offer a variety of events, which you can find out about on our website. One of the things we're working on is building out media offerings and resources for people to learn about different practice communities. And so in this short series, I've been interviewing a few different monastics about what monasticism means in their tradition, and the kind of actual logistical sort of material questions of monastic life a little bit more. I think it's common for people to have a kind of a preconception or an idealized view, or a kind of not really know what it actually means to be a Buddhist monk. Or at least when I was just getting into Zen practice, I didn't know there were monks in the US. And so wanted to have a conversation with a few monastics who I know and trust about their experience and what their particular traditions view of monastic life really is. And so that's a little bit of context about Dharma Gates and about the intention for the interview. And we'll just quickly turn over to actually talking with Shugen about his experience and background and the practice at Zen Mountain Monastery, where he is the current residing abbot. So thank you, Shugen, for joining me for this hour just to talk about the practice. And I think briefly, this question can obviously expand to fill any amount of time. So it could be just like a 3 to 5 minute answer, but I'd be curious how you ended up in the position you're in the kind of role of, you've been ordained at ZMM for a long time, and what was the kind of arc of encountering practice and training really that got you where you are right now.
Well, briefly, I grew up in a non-religious home in Atlanta, where I grew up in Georgia. And, when I was a teenager, began thinking about things, reflecting, looking around, noticing not so much my friends, but my friends' parents, the adult that I might become, that I would become, and just the way people were living their lives and how happy they seemed or not. And I began wondering about, does anybody really know what's going on here? And I was pretty adamant about not being religious. And then I began to explore it in high school. I'd go to different churches and on Sundays and different services. And just to see, I was really looking not so much to join a church, but to see if there was alive, what I might recognize as some living kind of religion or spirituality. I really didn't fully understand what I was doing or looking for, but I was just responding to what I was going on inside of me. And I had some different experiences that showed me that there was living expressions that it seemed real to me and genuine, but were not mine. And then just after high school, I was 17, and I encountered a book on Zen. At that time, there was very little written. There were only a few books available. Of course, you go to the encyclopedia to learn about Buddhism. But I encountered that, and it hit me very strongly, very deeply, and I began meditating. There was instruction in the book on meditation. And that also made sense to me. It wasn't always easy, but that sense, I was a musician, so that sense of going into a room and practicing something every day was familiar to me. So I just began meditating without any real plan or idea of where that was going. It just seemed like the right thing to do. And it also was speaking to something. And the very few teachings that I was able to encounter spoke to me very deeply and in a way that I'd never experienced before. I thought, these people know something. They have some understanding about the way things work. They have some understanding about me that I don't even know. And I just kept doing that. I kept sitting, finished school, traveled, work, college, and eventually found my way up north and was living in the Hudson Valley and was introduced to the monastery here. That was about 1984, and started coming pretty regularly. And at the same time that my life was, I was in school, in graduate school, I was studying mathematics, wanted to be a teacher. And that kind of fell apart. And this became just more and more important until I had a moment where I really knew I wanted to make this my life. And so that next Sunday came here and talked to Dr. Roshi, who was the abbot then, and my teacher at that point, and told him that I wanted to be a monastic. And he was very encouraging. The head monk kind of was a little dismissive. And that was a good balance. Because, people come in and they have ideas about being monastics, and, it doesn't usually pan out. So it was good to encounter both the encouragement and the skepticism. It's good for my ego. And so I shortly after that came into residency. That was 1986. In fact, another anniversary passed on March 1. And then I was ordained in 1988. So that's, in a sense, the outside part of how I got here.
Great. And in telling a story like that, I noticed that there's the kind of like finding the practice part. And then, you've also lived at Zen Mountain Monastery for 40 years. I guess it's a long time. 1986 to now is almost 40 years. And I know it can be extremely difficult to describe like the internal life of living at a monastery, but what's it been like, if that's possible?
Well, every person who comes here brings themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so whatever was happening before keeps happening. And so the fluctuations, the moods, the highs and lows, the challenges, the irritations, whatever patterns have been established, whatever views are in place, attachments, fears, all of that, they continue to be there. And in a way, they get stronger because there's very little diversion away from it. And because everybody's practicing and developing their meditative eye, and so things are seen and felt more keenly in ourselves and each other. And we're also living in community. So one of the sort of aspects of the Zen tradition is, certainly in the way that I've trained, is that the Sangha, the residential community, really goes through the whole day together. We wake up together, we do meditation together, we do services together, we go to work together, we have meals together. So there's the individual practitioner sort of blending with the unified Sangha all throughout the day. And so we're in close quarters. And so there will be people in the community that you like and resonate with, and others who irritate you. There's a truism in religions that no matter what monastery you go to, someone has been invited to come there specifically to make you crazy. And when they leave, somebody else will replace them. And so, and I certainly had that experience, and I went through lots of highs and lows. But in practice, those, what the Buddha realized is that dukkha, the basic suffering that we experience, really comes out of a desire to try and control our environment, to control relationships, to control the experiences we're having, so that we avoid painful experiences and have as much pleasure as possible. And so in living within a monastery, you renounce many of those forms of control. You don't choose when you're going to wake up or who you're going to be sitting with or what food you're going to be eating or when you'll be going to bed. All of those things we freely enter into and choose to take up together. And so that self that arises, our conditioned self, our karmic self arises, and we, go through a lot of fluctuations and doubts and insecurities but as practitioners, we're learning how to see those very clearly, take responsibility for what is our responsibility, and that there's a calming aspect that is a very essential part of the meditative process. Emotions, negative thinking, energy. And so it's all working together. And so that over time, my teacher used to talk about how those peaks and valleys would eventually sort of level out. And I thought, what does that mean? That everybody is just sort of beige, and kind of flat. But if you read the stories of the teachers and our ancestors, they are not beige. They are not flat. They are very vibrant individuals. What he was talking about was that those tumultuous aspects of those fluctuations, the things that sort of overwhelm us and take us over and that we sort of, are at the mercy of, those things, they just resolve. They begin to resolve and dissolve and are no longer rising in the same way, with the same frequency, with the same strength. We're much more able to practice them. And ultimately, we begin to see their real nature and realize that they're not what we thought they were at all. And so that's like the arc of particularly monastic practice, because, we're in it for our lifetimes. And so that's why it's very, it will always be a highly, in a sense, self-selecting lifestyle, like any monastic community will be, because a person has to really personally be drawn, for very deep, strong spiritual reasons to that life, and that it makes sense to them that they would do that. It makes it's my teacher used to talk about a spiritual imperative, that it's an imperative. I mean, I had a life before here. I know I could make it on my own. That's not an issue. This has to be a freely given choice. It can't be because people can't live in the world. But in the world before I came here, and I did a lot of exploring and examining, I just wasn't finding inspiration for my life. I found a lot of inspiring people and people doing inspiring things. But in terms of finding my life, the life I wanted to live, I wasn't finding my inspiration in the things that I was seeing, and that I did find in this life. Do find in this life.
That kind of moves into the next question I had, which is one of the ordination is this, to say it's like a significant force within Buddhism is like an understatement. It's been like one of probably the primary institution of Buddhism has been the monastic community. But one of the things that I'm interested in is that what monasticism means and looks like and what the actual commitments are varies a lot between especially the different lineages that have come to the West, and I don't think people actually understand how different it means to be a Buddhist monk sometimes between different communities. And so I'm curious, like, what is the spirit or the inquiry of ordination like at ZMM, or in, I think specifically talking about ZMM would probably be good even compared to like Soto Zen, because I know it's different somewhat.
Well, in the Soto lineage and in I think Zen in the West, when people are ordained, very often, I mean, there are very few monasteries, a couple that are really functioning as monasteries in terms of training monastics. And so usually in the West, when people are ordained, they're ordained as priests, and they typically would have, in many ways, a lay life. They would have a home and family and relationships and work and be self-supporting and so on. And if they're a teacher, they might be, that all might be happening in a Dharma center, but they might still have a home and family and children and so on. My teacher wanted to really create a clear sort of distinction. And so between the lay and the ordained. And so the laity is the lay practitioner who lives at home and has all of those aspects of a worldly life. And for us, the monastic is a life vow to live in a monastery, to live in this monastery, or just to serve the teacher, to serve the community. And so I spent 10 years, for instance. My teacher asked me to go to Brooklyn, where we have a Zen center, and to be in charge there, to teach there. And he asked me, would I do that? And I said, yes, I will, because my life is a life of vow. And I wanted to do whatever I could to serve the Sangha. And I expected to be there for the rest of my life. You know, I expected to be the abbot there and to make that my home for the rest of my life. Circumstances changed such that I was brought back to the monastery. And so now this is where my life is. But that's just a sort of an example of the life of the monastic, is that the vows that we take are a vow of service, a vow of stability, a vow of simplicity, a vow of selflessness, and a vow to accomplish the Buddha's way. Stability refers to having sort of resolved one's major life decisions. So a monastic is clear that they don't want to go on long traveling trips. They don't want to have a family. They don't want to go start a career. Those kinds of things are settled. It also, for us, means that a monastic may have a committed relationship with another person, but they are not to have children. If they have children, then those children, before they become ordained, then those children need to be independent. Because the life of the monastic, one, has no personal wealth. We can't support a family, and we have no time because our lives are given to the monastic life in the community. And so we have monastics who are solitary and are not in an intimate relationship, and we have others who are. Simplicity involves any kind of personal possessions and wealth, so we don't accumulate wealth. And so we basically just have whatever we came with. We're provided with a small stipend and health insurance. Anything else that is needed that stipend doesn't cover is provided for by the monastery, like winter coats and things like that. It also means that if we were to inherit money, so for instance, when my mother died, I inherited my portion of her estate, and that came down through my grandparents. So I don't take that personally. So I gave it away, and so monastics, before they're ordained, have to release any personal wealth that they have. And if they have a car, for instance, then that car would either be given away or become, they'd give it to the monastery. They can do whatever they want. So, and then the vow of selflessness is really to live the Dharma, to live, as in service, as realizing that the self is not an independent entity. And so those vows sort of form, and we talk about formation, the formation of a monastic. And so the pathway for that is that somebody who is interested would first come into residency and begin just residential training like I did. At some point, they would need to become a formal student. So they formalize their relationship with their teacher so that they have a teacher and they're now in training. And then at some point they would, and these are usually in increments of a year, but at minimum, they would then ask to receive the Bodhisattva precepts. So now they're taking the vows of the Bodhisattva, the moral teachings. And then after that, if they want to continue, they would ask to become a postulant. And at that point, they start meeting with the monastic council, which is the group of ordained monastics. And their role is having gone through that whole process, living this life. They have a very good experience and a lot of wisdom about what this life is and how to help people through that process of discernment. And so postulancy is basically they just put on a black robe. It's essentially the same as a lay robe, but it's black. They don't take any vows. not that much changes, but they begin to see themselves and be seen now as part of the monastic community. And so they begin to get a sense, a living sense of what it's like, what it might be like. And then to go forward, then they would become a novitiate. So now they do take vows, the monastic vows, but provisionally. They're not lifetime vows. So they take them for the period of time in which they're a novice. So now they're actively living those vows. They take on the robe of the monastic. They don't shave their head yet. It's not final. Now they're even more identified as a monastic. They see themselves that way. And while this is happening, of course, years are passing. So their life is becoming more and more centered on the monastery, right? And so they're really experiencing the life from inside. And then ultimately, if they continue and are accepted, then they would have full ordination. So they would shave their head, they would receive the okesa. And at that point, they are committing themselves to this life for a lifetime. Now, that's a free commitment, right? That's a commitment freely given. And so we have had monastics who have ordained with the full intention to make this their life forever. And then as they were living this life, and I think usually as it was working and helping them to free them in their life, some of them decided that they wanted to take off their robes and re-enter lay life and take up some other form of service. And so while it is a lifetime commitment, like a marriage, I mean, I hope people don't get married, for like as long as if I feel like it, or as long as I get everything I want. In other words, it's a real commitment. And yet sometimes marriage couples will part in a relationship, right? Because of things that have changed. And so with the monastic, it is a lifetime vow that we take very seriously, and with the recognition that nobody knows how that's going to play out over time.
Yeah, that's a lot of I imagine, and I know, I guess I spent a good amount of time at ZMM, that it is like a very, very gradual kind of inquiry and process for a lot of people, and that it's really not you show up for a weekend and you just decide you want to stay. It's not
it's really a wonderful process, because I think it's rare in life that with a really serious decision that somebody's considering, that somebody has the opportunity to go through it in that very slow and careful, thoughtful way, and have all of the support and guidance. And so that how it resolves, for me, the people who have gone through that process and ultimately decided not to become a monastic, for me, that was a successful process, right? The point of discernment is not that they become a monastic, but that they discover how they want to live their life. And that however it resolves, now they have that clarity. And that if they decide not to be a monastic, then hopefully they can really take that clarity, that confidence into whatever they do choose to do. So I think it's really a wonderful process. When I went through it, we only had 2 ordained monastics at that point. We were a very small community, and things tended to move a little quicker. We needed all hands on deck, right? And so, but over time, that has sort of naturally slowed down a little bit as we see that that's really helpful.
Mm-hmm. One more point, I think we kind of touched on it, but I think it's worth circling back on, which is I think a lot of people in kind of popular culture, or even people who have a regular meditation practice, they think that being a Buddhist monk is like a life of retreat and a life kind of on this mountaintop, going for personal liberation. And that is an expression of Buddhist practice. There's historical precedent for that. And I don't think people really understand or have ever encountered this kind of the monastic life that's so community based and so service based, and really this expression of like this concept of the bodhisattva vow and how it applies to really like a life of service. And so I
Yeah.
think it might be I'd be curious to hear if there's any kind of, that wasn't exactly a question, but reflections of that. Like it does seem to striking to me the difference there.
Yeah, and of course that is going to vary depending on the tradition and the monastery. So we are self-supporting. I mean, people are generous and offer donations, but we don't use those to run the monastery. Other centers will rely on donations to run their center. We do not. My teacher is always very strong-minded about that, and I agree with him. And so in the early years, when things were very lean and difficult financially, we tried all kinds of ways to generate income so we could support ourselves. Eventually, we turned towards just running programs and retreats and doing sort of offering what we do as a monastery to the lay sangha, and that became our support. And so to do that, we run this place, and so we have to have a bookkeeper and then people who are handling media and just grounds and buildings and all of the stuff that's necessary. And we've also cultivated. We have an orchard. We have a vibrant garden. We have a stitchery. We grow flowers and make dyes and create our own products that we sell. So we have bees that we create honey. Well, the bees create the honey. We gather it. And so we find different ways, both of sort of, and this is part of the Zen tradition, that Zen communities historically were self-supporting. And so work became an important part of spiritual life. And that is true for us as well. So that is a part of our day. That's what we're doing right now. And people move through different responsibilities. And so the support staff is us. And that's in a way wonderful, because then we're all taking equal responsibility for helping to provide this for ourselves and everyone else. And we're also getting the opportunity to really bring our meditation off the cushion into all kinds of different activities and endeavors, which is really the essence of Buddhism, is to live it. So it's not just something, some liberation that I'm experiencing on the cushion, but as soon as I get off and encounter something difficult, I come apart. So we have to keep moving in and out until that becomes seamless. And that boundary between internal and external, between sacred and mundane, begins to dissolve. And we really become wholly integrated. And so that is very much a part of our life. And, we try and hold it in balance. We're very much involved, with the lay sangha. We do, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We, have done anti-racism and anti-patriarchy work for years. We have done environmental work. So we do a lot of work with people who are incarcerated. And so we are going beyond the boundaries of the monastery, but we also continually recognize that we are a monastery. That's really our main offering. There are other organizations that do some of the things we do much better than we do, right? Because that's their whole gig. And so we're not trying to be social activists, even though we do some activist work. We're trying to really preserve and develop monastic life, because we feel like that's so important. As you said, it's been so important in the history of Buddhism. And I feel that it's so important for people, for anyone who wants to train in this way, whether it's for a weekend or a week or whether it's for a lifetime, to have that opportunity. I mean, we have endless examples of how to live worldly lives as lay students, but very few examples of how to live as a monastic in this world. And, there are those ancestors before me in different traditions. And I believe, too, that the monastery is, in a way, has a very vital role to play in a society. We don't really see it that way in this society, but I believe that that's true, that there need to be places that are not all about production and consuming and busyness, and are really preserving sort of ancient arts of quiet and stillness and reflection, contemplation, of deep meditation, of cultivating compassion, of using your body as an instrument, to sweep a floor, to make a meal. These sort of primal aspects of being a human being that we don't necessarily have a lot of patience for, or even of an understanding of or value for. And so I think of this place as a preserver, trying to preserve some of those essential aspects of what it actually means to be a human being, and to be a human being with each other, and to demonstrate that it is possible to actually live together harmoniously. And that when it's not harmonious, that we can be an example of how to deal with that, how to acknowledge that, how to take responsibility for that, how to repair that, and come back to that place of harmony. And so I think of monasteries throughout the ages as a being sort of laboratories for that.
I mean, I'm obviously very much in your camp of that I think these institutions have an extremely important role. And, from the perspective of somebody who's spent a good amount of time coming up, well, it's all relative based on people's involvement at ZMM, which often goes back decades, but you can feel that. You can feel coming into that container where there's such a depth of long-term engagement and commitment that it's very palpable. It becomes this resource that other people can step into. And in a way, I think of my experience of like sesshin practice is that it's this strange kind of accelerant of like, you could try to sit a certain amount of hours per day by yourself, but you can't make sesshin, like the kind of 6-day retreats at ZMM, like replicate just by sitting a certain amount of time. There's something about the actual, like, the energetic stew of all of the people there, and also the practice of the monastics that like helps the teachings come through in a different way.
Yeah, I think of it as a symphony. A symphony is a collection of a number of different instruments. And each instrument in and of itself is complete and makes its own beautiful music. When they all come together, they are both at the same time individual and they're not, right? Something else happens that isn't just the sum of its parts. It's something extraordinary. It's something that really transcendent. And I think of what you're describing, Aaron, as that experience of being within community and practicing together in a way that's very, in a way, private. No one really knows what's going on inside of anybody else. No one can experience someone else's experience. And so there's this very profound solitude that is present at the same time that we're essentially doing the same thing together in very close quarters with each other. And there's something that is inexpressible about that. When the COVID hit and we shifted everything to online and we're trying just to keep everybody going and keep everything together, it became very clear to the monastics very quickly how important that was to do that, and how profound it was that we could do that. And at the same time, how hugely different it was than being in the physical presence of each other. That there is something that you can't measure, that can't be, fully articulated or even think understood, but it is felt. It's a palpable thing. And I think that's something that is ancient and will never go away as long as we're human beings. And that is one of the functions of a Dharma center in a monastery is, as you said, not just to provide a place where people can practice, but also a place where people have dedicated their lives. And we can see I remember how that was for me, to see the example of somebody who was living this life, which at that point for me seemed very daunting. But just the effect that had on me before I even thought that it was what I wanted to do, that kind of commitment, that kind of dedication. And I want to say also that it goes both ways, from the lay to the monastic, from the monastic to the lay, that as a monastic, and I think I speak for my community here, we are profoundly inspired by the lay students and the lives that they're living. I talk to people all the time, students who are doing wonderful, wonderful things in their lives. And I am so happy that they're doing that, because I can't, right? I can't be that teacher in a schoolroom. I can't be that construction worker. I can't be that person working for that not-for-profit. I can't be that parent. But I'm so glad that they are, because those things need to be done, and that they are practitioners, and that they are so sincere in their practice, and they're practicing, they're really making space for this, and they're centering in ways that are oftentimes not easy. And so in a way, I feel like one of the great services that we offer is in providing a place where people can come in and study and encounter the Dharma and have their lives transformed. And then when they go out, they're like ambassadors, not to spread the Dharma, so to speak, not to convert people, but just through their lives to live really good lives, and to be, in a way, a silent spokesperson for the Dharma, just by doing that and by changing the world in their own particular field of influence. And so I think often, and particularly at times when I've wondered, is my life too small? Am I hiding out on the mountain? Are we doing enough? Should we be out there, trying to, take on some of the most significant issues? And then I think again about the Sangha, our Sangha, who is doing many of those things. And then I think about our role, which is to provide and maintain and keep strengthening this for all of us. And so I just wanted to say that it goes in both directions, and that's very important. And that was something that Daido Roshi was very clear about. And he really understood, because he started out as a lay practitioner. And that kind of mutual support and affirmation and strengthening that happens between, and that's one reason he wanted to make them distinct. He didn't want to make them blurry. He wanted the monastic to have a very clearly defined life, and the lay student have a very clearly defined life and practice, so that they could really make a conscious choice and then really let that blossom.
Yeah, thank you for that's 100% been my experience. So it's thanks for sharing. I think we're coming up on, we have 20 minutes to wrap things together. This might be a big topic, but I think it's definitely worth touching in on, which is there is a lot of hype in kind of online Dharma spaces about people talking about attainments and states and stages and the sort of the maps of practice. And I know that in a way, I think some people might find practicing at ZMM a little bit disconcerting in the my experience is that it's almost the exact opposite of you practice for a very long time, and the notion of states and stages and kensho and all of this are really not in my experience the emphasis, and yet there is this depth and this kind of like long-term commitment. And I think it might be helpful to think of what is enlightenment how do you guys how do you think about or teach or relate to these concepts of depth or measuring one's practice, or what does that mean? Because some people, I think, if someone's coming from a background or a worldview where that's so prominent, it's such a different way of moving.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and something that every practitioner really has to meet and work through. And particularly for us, because we're such a materialistic society, a very acquisitional, we appropriate, it's like it's a very possessive, sort of taking possession of kind of culture. And so enlightenment can just become another sort of the ultimate possession. And that's not unique to Westerners, because of our minds that have an inclination to grasp. And so here, enlightenment is, a person can have a very sincere desire to liberate themselves from their suffering. And that can also bring in elements of grasping and clinging and expectation and so on. And I think it comes with Buddha Dharma. I think it comes with the path as being profoundly aspirational. I mean, the bodhicitta, the bodhisattva vows is probably the greatest aspiration you could have, right? To realize self and other and alleviate all suffering. One thing I would say is, and this is just my personal view, is that I would caution serious practitioners, sincere practitioners, and be very careful about entering into all of those conversations, because it's a lot of talk and there are a lot of opinions, and that's fine. But when you look at it from the point of view of karma, that when we think and when we speak and when we act, we are creating karma. We're molding our mind. We're sort of creating our consciousness around within those actions. And so the more we think about certain things, the more they become objects in our mind, the more objectified they become. And the more we begin telling stories about those things. And then we listen to other people's stories about those things, which may or may not have much to do at all with the thing itself. And so I sometimes will caution practitioners not to not have conversations and talk. That's everybody's business, but their own business, but to just be aware that in those conversations, it is affecting them, right? Both during and after. And I was always very wary about those in my early years, because I heard people having conversations, and sometimes they seemed quite genuine and benign, and sometimes they felt very ego-centered, where people were sort of, strutting. And I just thought, sometimes the conversation replaces the practice, or the conversation becomes a kind of buffer, or it can sort of create a false sense of what is actually happening. And so I just throw that out, that I think, of course, we were going to talk about the Dharma, share with each other. That can be very inspiring. We can help each other. And I guess I would just say, notice when it is actually in that realm and when it starts to move into another realm, and choose accordingly. But, I talk about realization a lot and enlightenment, because we need to know that is actually the basis of this path. And at the same time, that the moment we grab onto that, it's not enlightenment. It's not realization. We're trapping ourselves. We're just trapping ourselves with a different kind of idea. And so for the monastic, to tie it in, the monastic takes a vow to accomplish the Buddha's way, a vow of selflessness. And a vow is a living thing, right? It's a sincere pledge to follow through on something. It's not a vow to have accomplished the way by the time I'm, 45, or to accomplish it according to my plan or my desires of what that even will look like. It's none of that. That's the difference between an aspiration, which is completely open, and an expectation, which is very closed and already has a very strong idea of what that's going to be like. And so monastics make a vow which to that, because that means there is a lifetime of continually beginning again and continually evolving and growing. One of the kisses of death for a monastery is stagnation. And I've been in monasteries that felt rather stagnant. It did not feel that vibrancy, that liveliness, that sort of beginner's mind of people dedicating themselves to a religious life and living it, being humble, starting over, continually inquiring. And that's what the monastics here, that's what we pledge to ourselves and what we try and cultivate with each other. And so that means we look for the signs of when it begins to become stagnant or calcified so that we can shake that off. And so, and all of that is within. We're not just evolving towards some amorphous, random ideal, but it is to enlighten, liberate ourselves from our delusions, from our false views and attachments, from our grasping at the illusion of the self. It's pretty clearly, presented in terms of what it is we're trying to do. And then the challenge is to be wholehearted about that, to throw your whole person into it, but without grasping. And that's a path, that's a practice, right? Because we will cling, we do cling. We do have expectations, and those will always cause suffering. And so that's just an essential part of the journey. To avoid talking about it, I think is a tremendous disservice, because it's, if people don't hear that is possible and that is how this has come down to us, then how can they cultivate that aspiration for themselves? How can they gain confidence that they can do that because other people have done that, right? Past and present. And so I think it's very important. And I think sometimes teachers or communities shy away from it because people do get caught up in it. And that causes suffering, and people feel insecure and that they're not good enough, that whole self-critical voice. And I see that. And I've had that in my early years. But I feel like the way to free ourselves of that is not by trying to avoid it, right? It's also not to fan that into flames that is unhealthy, but to, it's a middle path. And so to have that aspiration there, because that is what the Buddha gave us, right? With his own enlightenment. He showed us that is possible.
You touched
But
on
let me, if I can, let me just an addendum to that. It's said in the teachings that all of that said that one of the most accurate ways to discern whether your practice is developing nicely and that you're gaining understanding is whether the proliferation of your negative thoughts and emotions is quieting down and the development of more wholesome and healthy and compassionate thoughts and emotions are rising. Do you find yourself less self-centered? Do you find yourself less reactive? Do you find yourself naturally having more concern for others? That those are ways that we can be assessing if we must.
You talked a little bit about, that a monastery must be continually evolving. And I know from like hearing you and others talk at ZMM that the monastery has changed a lot since its inception, and also is in a way, this experiment of what is a Western, like a Zen monastery, a Buddhist monastery in the West. And I'm curious, like, what's still changing? Like, what are the directions or the kind of like inquiries? If someone was to come now to ZMM, like how might things be different in their training compared to maybe how you trained? Or
well, certainly the integration of racial, gender justice work that we're doing, trying to undo patriarchy, those are things that I felt very strongly about, largely due to my own karma, my upbringing in the South, and so on. And so that's been a very important element of our training that we've integrated. And there's no precedent for that, really, going back into Buddhism. The Buddha spoke about the caste system, the sort of one of the forms of oppression at his time, but he wasn't trying to dismantle it. And so that aspect of what we're doing is very powerful and is certainly part of our evolution and has been very demanding in terms of how do we do this and how do we really understand this as Dharma, which to me is self-evident, but it needs to be made clear because it's not always for others. Also Zen, as it's come down to us, our lineages through Japan, then through China and back to India, it was very hierarchical, was very top down. And my teacher, who I will be forever grateful to, and who was an incredible teacher, and did something here that I think few people could have done. I couldn't have done it. I couldn't have started this place. And he was a patriarch. He was very strong. He was very much, in command and sort of taught and governed in that way. And that's sort of, I have a different temperament. And so when I stepped into this role, I knew that was going to have to evolve because it just wasn't my sort of way of doing things. That didn't feel natural to me. And so we sort of started with a very strong vertical spine. You might look at it that way. And what we've been doing is trying to create a very strong horizontal plane. And so we've been developing different advisory and governing bodies that bring more voices and more diversity into the running of the place and sort of bringing new perspectives and as a way of being more involved, more the Sangha is involved in training the Sangha. And at the same time that, there's still an abbot and there's still teachers and there's still senior students, and that we still recognize that there are people who have been doing this for a long time and have developed understanding and wisdom, both in terms of the Dharma, in terms of just how to run a monastery, that there are things that when the newer monks didn't experience, because they weren't here, and that were extremely formative for me in terms of what I was learning about myself, about the monastic life, about how to run a monastery. And those things will come for them in their own way. But those things you can't get any other way. You have to live them and live through all kinds of challenges and ups and downs. And so that becomes part of our evolution, and it including crises, where, people act badly or act out, or people in power, abuse that power. And so, as things like that have happened, we have addressed them, we've, attended to them, we've built in ways of trying not to create a fertile ground for those kinds of things to happen in the first place, by having more openness and transparency and accountability. And so we tried very simply to learn from our mistakes and never stop, and to listen closely to people who have perspectives that we might not have had so that we can evolve at the same time that we're preserving something very ancient. And that's a really amazing kind of dynamic, to really try and revere tradition and recognize how powerful this vessel of the Buddha Dharma is, and that has been handed down to us. And we have a sacred responsibility, I feel, to maintain that and to let future generations experience that. And at the same time, we have to change, we have to evolve. And so how do you hold both of those in a very alive dynamic so that they work together is, I think, one of our great gifts and ongoing, inquiries.
Yeah, thank you. That's so we're approaching the hour mark, and I think one kind of nice way to wrap it together might be just to share a little bit about, Dharma Gates as one of the things we've been doing is recommending people when people are interested in retreats or residential practice or kind of intensifying their practice. Where can they go? Where can they go experience something more, something deeper than maybe what they have the capacity to do? themselves. And maybe we've recommended in a few Dharma Gates people have gone and done a month or longer. And what's that? Like how can somebody kind of step into this kind of container? And obviously monasticism's a long ways off from that experience, but just for someone who's interested in a deeper kind of taste of Zen training, like how does that what's available?
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, we've been doing that since the beginning. And so, for instance, this weekend, tonight, we'll have a group of people coming in to do a introduction to Zen training retreat. We do this every month. And so that's a really excellent way to begin because you're in it. There's a lot of teachings that are given, but you're also experiencing it. And then we talk about, if, for people who are interested, what next steps might be. The temple in Brooklyn, we have some affiliate groups. So basically anywhere that the Dharma is taking place, to go and, experience it basically is the best way. And my encouragement is just keep your ground under your feet, and just take one step at a time. Sometimes people get way ahead of themselves in terms of, conjecturing or imagining. It's not going to turn out like that. So just keep the ground under your feet, take one step at a time, and let each step that you take inform you. So if a person comes here and this is a very positive experience and they might come back and do something more, maybe it helps to clarify that they want to move in a different direction. My encouragement also is whatever path you take it with your heart, take it with sincerity. Make sure it's worthy of your effort. Do your homework, make sure that it's a true path, and then give yourself to it to the degree that is right for you right now. Don't get ahead of yourself. And then you'll see, right? And in that way, each person's path unfolds very naturally and nicely, right? And in ways that you can't predict. I certainly never expected this to be my life. I had other plans. So be prepared to be surprised, but at the same time, know that every step you take is yours, right? You are making that choice. It's with your permission. And the next step after that, and after that, it'll be the same. So you don't have to worry.
Well, thank you, Shugen, for this wonderful conversation. I think I'll wrap up with just a couple words about Dharma Gates, and I'm also going to post some of the kind of intro links to Zen Mountain Monastery on the description, so you can check that if you're interested. But just a little bit more about how you can get more involved with Dharma Gates if you're listening to this and don't know much about us. The biggest thing is to sign up for our newsletter on our website, so dharma-gates.org. And if you scroll to the bottom, there's a newsletter, and that's where we send out all of our offerings and resources and everything basically that we're doing. You can also explore our website. We do in-person meditation retreats with various teachers, Buddhist teachers from different lineages, all donation-based, and those are accessible to people 18 to 35. And then we do a variety of online things, which I won't list them all, but those are available to everybody. So yeah, thank you for listening, and thank you for joining me, Shugen. And I'm gonna wrap up here.